Hey everyone, Andrew here, and it's time for another series review. This one is a bit like the Giver series that I talked about, where the first book is super well known, and you maybe have heard of like the second book, but the rest of the series most people have never heard of. And this one gets weird when you look at the entire series of it, because the first two books that he wrote are really straightforward and really clear, but when you start adding in the later books, it gets a little convoluted and a little confusing. But I'm going to talk about it a bit, because I really do love this series. It's really interesting, and that is the Hatchet series by Gary Paulsen. So, Gary Paulsen, you've all probably heard of The Hatchet, which is the first book that he did. This was written back in 1987. It's a Newbery Award-winning, amazing, young adult surviving in the wilderness story. It had an immediate sequel that came out that was called The River, and then it had 3 more sequels that came out that really messed up the timeline and got super confusing and super weird with some of them. Not weird as in like, oh, aliens and that stuff, just confusing-ish a little bit. But let's take a little bit of time to talk about The Hatchet. So, The Hatchet is the story of a 13-year-old named Brian Robson, who basically his parents had just got divorced and his father is working up in the Canadian mountains. Brian's mother is sending him up to his father for the summer, and she gives him this silver hatchet to take with him for the wilderness. Brian is on this little puddle jumper, little bush plane heading into the northern wilderness when the pilot has a massive heart attack and dies. So Brian has to take over, tries to land the plane on this small lake, but ends up crashing it. And he ends up stranded in the middle of the Canadian wilderness with nothing but a hatchet to his name. And it's all about surviving the wilderness, about learning how to make a fire, and how to hunt, and how to create a shelter, and what things you can eat and what things you can't, and how to deal with like mosquitoes and the horrible animals out there, because there's some really dangerous ones out there. I never thought a moose could be terrifying. This book made me terrified of mooses, because it's like basically the moose gets mad at Brian, and tackles him and pushes him into the lake and keeps pushing him under the water and will not let him get up until he stops moving. Brian nearly drowns because of a freaking crazed moose. But Brian eventually develops, survival skills, learn what works, and becomes a woodsmith. He crafts his own bows and arrows, his own fishing spear, and he's actually managing to survive in this scenario. So during one of the nights, a tornado appears and basically racks through his whole camp area and the lake and everything. Brian manages to survive, and during the tornado, basically the tail end of the plane ends up washed up on the shore, and Brian starts to realize, or starts to think, there should be a survival pack on that plane with some gear that could help him survive better. So he ends up building a raft, swimming out into the middle of the lake, and diving down and manages to get the survival pack. The survival pack includes, food rations, a rifle, a shovel, and also happens to have an emergency transmitter. Brian turns this on, tries to make it work, but it doesn't seem to be working, so he just kind of throws it aside. However, it does actually work, and a nearby passing airplane managed to hear a call, and they actually come in and rescue him. And that's how the Hatchet ends. And really, really good book. Just expertly written. Great survival story. You feel everything that's Brian going through. The hunger, the isolation, the survival, the terror. It's just expertly written young adult book. And then we get into the sequels. And I had to try to figure out how I was going to do this. Because as I said, the next book written was The River. But chronologically, the next book is actually the third book, which is Brian's Winter. And I figured I'd do chronologically because while it doesn't really matter for the river where it is, it does matter for books 4 and 5. So, Brian's Winter is Paulsen's response to his fan base being mad about how Hatchet ended. Basically, a lot of people called it a Deus Ex ending, where the transmitter just randomly works. And it's just like, that just seems like an out of left field kind of finale. So Paulsen decided to write a book that was just basically what if that transmitter had never worked. So Brian's Winter takes place immediately after the end of Hatchet. Brian's now stuck in the wilderness still. He has a rifle, but it's only has a couple shots. He has to be very specific with it. He eats through all the food, of course, and now has to survive not only the fall, but the incoming winter. And this one follows almost all of the same beats that the last one did. It's all about learning to make new materials, having to survive. He had to build snowshoes and make a stronger bow. He had to learn about how to, make jerky and make meat that will last a little bit longer. He ends up killing this deer that feeds him for like a month, which is pretty cool, because he can just put the deer in the snow and that'll keep it preserved, which is kind of cool. But it's just a lot of the same beats for it. And then at the very end of the book, he stumbles upon this Cree trapping family called the Smallhorns. And they take him with them and then bring him home. And that's how book Brian's Winter ends. So instead of Deus Ex Machine, we get kind of a Deus Ex group of people. Because I don't understand how this is him disputing the Deus Ex, because it is just randomly, hey, these people from off that were never part of the story just randomly appear and save you. And yes, there's an explanation behind it. But there's also an explanation behind the transmitter in the plane being there and being waterproof, because it should be. So, yeah. I'm not the biggest fan of this one. I felt it was an unnecessary sequel. I thought the first book ended fine. It ended very well. I really liked the first book. This just feels like a rehash of that book, but with a winter setting. So, yeah, that's how I feel about Brian's Winter. We then get into book 3, which was originally book 2, which is The River. And basically, this takes place about a year or two after Brian has returned home. He's getting used to being back in society, but he still has some of those animalistic parts of himself. And he is visited by a member of the government named Derek Holzer. And Derek Holzer is a governmental psychologist that is training military soldiers and people to survive in the wilderness with very limited resources. And Brian is the prime example of how you can do that. And so he wants Brian to teach him everything he knows and lets him figure out the best way to teach someone to survive with almost nothing. Brian really doesn't want to do this, especially considering the plan is to go out to another lake and just reenact everything that he did the first time. But eventually Brian realizes that this is probably a good thing and decides to agree to do it and agrees to help, but he has the final say in everything. So, like, one of the first things that Derek tries to do is he's like, all right, we got our knives, we got an emergency radio, and then we have this whole thing of emergency supplies just in case we need them. And Brian went, no. It's like, and Derek's like, what? If we need some of this stuff, we might need it. It's like, and Brian's like, if we have that stuff, we will use it. You cannot tell me that if we are being set upon by hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes, that you aren't going to go reaching for that mosquito repellent just because we don't have to. Like, if we have the food, you're going to want to use it. If we have these supplies, you're going to use them. If you really want to learn how I survived, you have to do it the way I survived. So they're left out in the middle of the wilderness with just 2 knives and an emergency radio. And of course, immediately that night they are set upon by thousands upon thousands of mosquitoes. But Brian knows how to deal with it now, so they build a fire and they manage to scare off the mosquitoes. And Brian's actually finding this time around being a lot easier than the first. He now knows what to do. He now knows steps. You know, Brian has figured out how to survive and how to do it effectively. So they're actually doing really well. It's and becoming super easy for Brian. And then they have a thunderstorm, and lightning strikes their camp, and this ends up knocking Derek unconscious, and it puts him into a comatose state. It also damages the emergency transmitter. So now Brian is stuck in the middle of the woods again with a comatose patient who will dehydrate within a few days. They are basically supposed to rendezvous with the group, but that's not even supposed to happen for like 2 or 3 weeks. So Brian knows that he has to get Derek into civilization or Derek's going to die. And the difference between this current camp and the one before is that this lake, the lake of this site, has a river. It's connected to another water source. And that there is supposedly a trading post about 100 miles downriver. So Brian builds a raft, basically gets it all together, gets Derek on board, and has to navigate down this wild, unknown river, which is super interesting, really action-paced. Got a lot of rapids, a lot of different things happening down there. Like, you got exhaustion mixed with heat stroke, mixed with all this other stuff. And basically, they actually do manage to make it all the way downriver and get to the trading post, and Derek survives. And the two go back home, and Derek shows up a couple days later and brings Brian a gift, which is a canoe that he named the Raft as a thank you present. And it's really good. It's a really sweet, good follow-up to it. So originally, yeah, these two were the first 2 books, and as a pair, the Hatchet with the River works really, really well. They're a really good duo. You got Brian's Winter as this third, which kind of feels like a fan fiction. It feels like, but it just happens to be written by the author. So it's just a what if this happened. And if this has been it, this would be a great trilogy. And to be fair, the entire series is still good. But we end up with the book 4, which is Brian's Return. This takes place a couple years after the river, and Brian has now been back in humanity for a bit of a while, and he's not connecting very well. He's having a really hard time living in this society and doing these things and living this way, and he feels lost and missing something. So he ends up going to this psychologist who is named Caleb. He was an ex-cop who gone blind. Caleb realizes and comes to the conclusion that Brian doesn't see himself as someone who lives in the city, lives with people. He sees himself now as someone who lives in the wilderness, and that is what he's missing, and that is what he needs. He needs to go back out into the place that he belongs as, where he will be happy. And Brian's mother is completely against this, but agrees on the condition that it's just for the summer. Basically, the idea is that Brian is going to be dropped off downriver. He's going to go down up. He's going to be dropped off at one end of the river. He's going to travel via his canoe down the river to the trappers from the Winter series, who he's going to meet up with, and he's going to spend the winter with them and then come back home. Brian has absolutely no notion of ever returning. To him, he's going to go back to the wilderness, and that's where he's going to stay. That is his thinking. So he basically gets dropped off with the canoe and a moderate amount of supplies to, upriver, and starts his journey down. Yeah, basically he has like his hatchet, he has a flint and steel, he has salt, and a couple of stuff to help with the making of jerky and sustaining meat. He also has this big book of Shakespeare plays that Caleb gave him, and Caleb was like, you need to read these. I recommend reading 5 a day and read them out loud, because Shakespeare's meant to be heard, not read, which is interesting. And I was like, that was an interesting way of looking at Shakespeare, but it's also true. And basically, Brian, the second, like, he's back down the river and starts doing this, he starts to feel peaceful and at home, and everything starts to make sense. And it's really interesting. You get to a point where he's talking about starting to feeling hungry, and he's like, And that's okay. That's how it should be. I don't have to eat right now, but I know, it's just this is stop being hungry is part of this lifestyle. It's the way this place works. And then the book just kind of stops. It doesn't really have an ending. It's just him continuing down the river. But it's an interesting one. It's an interesting way of looking back and going back, having to realize that the events that you've experienced have changed you, and you have to adapt to them accordingly. And then we get onto Brian's Hunt, which is the 5th book in the series, and it's the last one that got written. But it was written back in 2003, so I don't think there's going to be any more, but who knows? So Brian's Hunt takes place immediately after the end of Brian's Return. He's still going downriver. He is very happy at this point, but he doesn't really miss human contact, but he does find his mind keeps returning to thoughts of the Trapper family that saved him from Brian's winter, specifically to their daughter Susan, who interestingly enough he has never met, but he has a picture of her that they gave to him, and they described her a lot as this adventurous, self-reliant young woman, and Brian feels a sort of connection to her that he doesn't really understand. While going downriver, Brian stumbles upon this very wounded dog. That it was a Malamute, which is kind of like a husky, a little bit bulkier, I think. Basically, he nurses this dog back to health, and in turn, he can tell that this dog is clearly domesticated, and he comes to the conclusion that this dog belonged to the Smallhorns, the trappers. So he continues downriver to get to them. He arrives at their cabin, and the entire thing is just decimated. And there was clearly a bear attack, and the bear had killed the parents, the older members of the Smallhorns. And he ends up finding Susan, who's basically been hiding in this cupboard the entire time, traumatized from the attacks. He gets her out and basically has her radio for help while he buries the family. She goes with the authorities to her relatives living in Winnipeg, and Brian decides to stay with the dog, and they decide that they're going to go and hunt down this bear and kill him as revenge. So Brian uses his tracking abilities that he's developed to try to track down the bear, but eventually realizes that he's been walking around in a big circle, and that it's not him hunting the bear anymore, the bear is hunting him. So instead of continuing that, he decides to wait and wait till the bear comes circling around to him. And they start fighting, they start attacking, and Brian ends up winning, and he kills the bear, and he's left feeling absolutely nothing. It does nothing to help the anger, it has nothing to help the revenge. At the end of the day, this was just a wild animal that wasn't evil, it was just doing what it did, and killing it doesn't bring back the people that have died. And Brian knows that he just has to do what he has always done, which is he has to use this as a means of survival, so he starts cutting up the bear and preparing it to be food and clothing and all the stuff that he needs to get by. And that's how book 5 ends. And yeah, this one's the real did I just read kind of the series. It really doesn't have all that much going on for it. It's honestly, I think it's the shortest of all the books. It doesn't have a lot plot-wise. It's just all kind of build up with nothing to it. It's like, and I was really kind of liking the idea of Susan and him finding someone who he could connect with and who would have the similar appreciation for nature and being out in the wild that he does. Because that is always one of those things that kind of saddened me about the idea of Brian's return. Is Brian said, I'm never returning to society. This is where I belong. This is where I'm going to stay. And it's like, okay, but then you're just going to be alone forever. And it's like, I wanted him to find someone, that would work well for him. And Susan seemed like a good answer to that, even though we didn't know anything about her. But she seemed like they were adding the possibility of that happening. And then of course, you get to the house and find the parents are dead. And I'm like, well, that's gone to pot. She'll never want to be in the wilderness again because the wilderness killed her freaking parents. So, yeah, and then you got the hunt at the end, and it's just like, Yeah, I understand you're enraged by what this thing did. It's still a wild animal. It still was just doing what it does. It wasn't like it was out for revenge like you are. So it's just kind of the weak ending for it, and it just feels like not even the end of the series. It feels like there should be another book after this, and there hasn't been one yet, and it's been 14 years, so we probably will never get another one. But I don't know. So yeah, overall, I think this series is actually absolutely amazing. Like, The Hatchet is one of the best kids books I have ever read. It's so well written, so well told. It's amazing. Just great look into survival and characters and all that stuff. The River is a super good follow-up to it. You get a really good, interesting story to it. You get good. It's a nice change in the dynamic where it's like, and I like the fact that the idea of like, oh yeah, because I already know how to survive, it's so much easier the second time around. So you know what to do versus having to do the trial and error that he had to do for all of the Hatchet. Brian's Winter is fine. It feels like a fanfic. It's just a lot of the same thing that happened in Hatchet. I don't super care for it, but it's okay. The Brian's Return, I actually really like. It's got some good symbolism. I like the idea of going back and having to realize that the events of your life have changed who you are. I just dislike the fact that it's an abrupt ending, but it kind of works too. And then Brian's Hunt is flawed. It's an easy read. They're all very easy reads. They're all a lot of fun. They have a really good look into the character. And overall, I would give this entire series like 4.5 out of 5. Like, Hatchet, River, and Brian's Return are all 5 out of 5s for me. And then Brian's Winter and The Hunt would be about 4 out of 5. Because they're good, but they have some flaws and some stuff that just doesn't really work, or just seems like tedious, or unimportant, or uninteresting. And yeah, that's my thoughts on the Hatchet series. What do you all think? Let me know in the comments if you guys have read the first one, or if you haven't ever even heard of the later ones. Let me know. Happy reading, y'all.